The night of the 22nd of March of 1944 was dark and moonless over the Ligurian Sea. 2 US Navy PT torpedo boats silently glided towards the Italian coast, transporting from Corsica 15 men of Company D of the Special Reconnaissance Battalion, 2677, a covert unit of the Office of Strategic Services. The mission, called Operation Geneva, had an apparently simple but strategically vital objective: to destroy a railway tunnel between La Spezia and Genoa, a crucial supply line that fed the German forces fighting on the Cassino and Anzio fronts. The military situation in Italy in March of 1944 had reached a frustrating stalemate for the Allies. After the landing in Salerno in September of 1943 and the subsequent campaign northward, the Allied forces had crashed against the formidable German defences. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had orchestrated a series of defensive lines that masterfully took advantage of Italy's mountainous terrain. The Gustav Line, anchored at the Monte Cassino monastery, had withstood multiple Allied assaults with devastating losses. Thousands of Allied soldiers had died trying to break these fortifications without achieving significant advances. The landing at Anzio, launched on the 22nd of January of 1944, had been designed to flank the German defences and threaten Rome. However, the operation did not gain the expected momentum. The Allied forces that landed found themselves contained at the beachhead, subjected to fierce German counterattacks. Instead of quickly liberating Rome, Anzio became another stagnant front where soldiers died for every metre of ground. In this context of strategic frustration, special operations gained increasing importance. If massive bombings and frontal assaults could not break the German supply lines, perhaps small teams of saboteurs could achieve what entire armies had not accomplished. The Allied bombers had repeatedly attempted to cut this railway line without success. The mountainous terrain made precision bombing difficult. The railway tunnels, dug deep into the Ligurian mountains, were practically invulnerable to air attacks. The Germans could quickly repair minor damage to exposed tracks. The solution required a different approach: a sabotage team placing explosives directly on critical structures, destroying tunnel sections that would take weeks or months to repair. The 15 soldiers were specifically selected because they were all Italian Americans. Most spoke Italian fluently, and some even knew the local dialects of the Genoa region. This selection was no coincidence. The Office of Strategic Services had identified that soldiers with Italian heritage would be invaluable for operations behind the lines in Italy. They could blend more easily with local populations, understand intercepted conversations, and potentially seek help from Italian civilians without immediately revealing that they were American soldiers. They carried 650 pounds of dynamite and wore full United States Army uniforms, without any attempt at camouflage or disguise. This decision to operate in appropriate uniforms was deliberate and crucial. Under the Hague and Geneva Conventions, soldiers operating in recognizable military uniform were entitled to protections as prisoners of war if captured. Saboteurs or spies operating in civilian clothes or enemy uniforms could be legally executed after trial. The mission planners understood these legal distinctions and equipped the team accordingly. The team was commanded by First Lieutenant Vincent Russo, who had already attempted this same mission 1 month earlier during Operation Geneva. On that occasion, the team had aborted after landing in the wrong place without being able to locate the target in the darkness. The experience had been frustrating, but educational. Russo and his men had meticulously studied shoreline profiles, consulted with Italian engineers from the railway maintenance section who had defected or been captured, and refined their navigation plans. Now they returned with better preparation and knowledge of the terrain, determined to complete what they had begun in February. Close to 23:45 hours, as the boats were approaching the coast, the Americans spotted a column of German S-boot torpedo boats returning from a mining mission. It was the kind of random encounter that could ruin carefully planned operations. One of the PT boats took evasive action and engaged in combat. while the other stayed close to the shore with one engine running, trying to maintain contact with the landing group. The roar of the engines and the exchange of fire briefly lit up the Mediterranean night. 3 inflatable rubber boats were launched into the water with the 15 soldiers, their weapons, and the explosive. They rowed into the darkness while the PT boats tried to cover their approach, each man aware that the element of surprise might have been compromised. When the rubber boats reached the rocky beach, Lieutenant Russo immediately recognized the mistake. They had landed near the village of Carpineggio, halfway between Bonassola and the Framura station, approximately 3 kilometers from their intended landing point and 2 kilometers from the target tunnel. Radio contact with the PT boats was lost almost immediately. Radio communications in 1944 were notoriously unreliable, especially in mountainous terrain near the coast, where signals bounced unpredictably. The American vessels waited in the area until 4 in the morning without receiving signals from the team, and finally had to return to Bastia due to mechanical problems and the presence of German patrols. On land, Russo and his men faced a complicated but not desperate situation. The contingency plan clearly outlined the procedure. If they were unable to complete the mission in the specified time, they should hide and wait for pickup the following night. The soldiers hid the rubber boats, explosives, and additional equipment on the rocky beach, covering everything as best as possible. When the dawn of the 23rd of March arrived, the team moved inland and found an abandoned barn on the outskirts of Carpineggio, where they took refuge. They had not eaten in 24 hours, so Russo and another soldier went out in search of food. They found a young farmer named Franco Lagazzo, who lived nearby. The Italian farmer, upon seeing the uniformed American soldiers, sold them food, and later in the day acted as their guide on a reconnaissance mission. Lagazzo led them to the Framura station and showed them the access to the target tunnel on the main railway line. The mission seemed viable again. The plan was to wait until the next night, when the PT boats would return to pick them up or receive instructions to proceed with the demolition. Indeed, that night, from the 23rd to the 24th of March, other PT boats left Bastia to support the mission. Their objective was to pick up the team or coordinate the sabotage operation. However, upon encountering German patrols near the designated meeting point, the American vessels were unable to make contact and were forced to return to base again. The morning of the 24th of March sealed the fate of the Ginny team. An Italian fisherman from Bonassola, returning to the coast, discovered the hidden rubber boats. The discovery of 650 pounds of dynamite next to the boats left no doubt about the nature of the operation. The fisherman immediately informed the Italian fascist authorities, who in turn alerted the local German command. A combined search patrol of Italian fascist militias and German troops was quickly formed to comb the area. During the afternoon, while the Americans remained hidden in the barn, Franco Lagazzo discovered that the Germans and Italians had found the boats. He ran to warn the soldiers, but his warning arrived too late. The search forces surrounded the stable where the 15 Americans were sheltering. After a brief exchange of gunfire, the Americans, completely outnumbered and with no chance of escape, surrendered. All members of the team were captured, along with Franco Lagazzo, the farmer who had helped them. The prisoners were transported to La Spezia and confined near the headquarters of the 135 Fortress Brigade, under the command of the German Colonel Kurt Olmers. This unit was subordinate to the 75th Army Corps, commanded by General Anton Dostler, whose headquarters was located in San Andrea, near Parma. The interrogations began immediately. Intelligence officers of the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service, conducted the interrogations in English. Korvettenkapitän Friedrich Klaps, commander of the small Abwehr station in La Spezia, and his assistant, Oberleutnant zur See Georg Sessler, applied interrogation tactics designed to exploit the inexperience of the prisoners. The German interrogators told Lieutenant Vincent Russo that his subordinate officer had already revealed all the details of the operation. It was a lie. No team member had spoken until that moment. Russo, believing that the information was already compromised, confirmed the details of the mission. They were American commandos sent to demolish a vital railway tunnel. Too late, he realized that he had been deceived. The information about the captured commands quickly reached the headquarters of the 75th Army Corps. General Anton Dostler, a 53-year-old professional soldier who had served in both World Wars, now faced a decision that would define his fate. Anton Josef Dostler was born on the 10th of May 1891 in Munich, in the heart of Bavaria, when the German Empire was at its peak under Kaiser Wilhelm II. He grew up in an imperial Germany confident in its power and destiny, where military service was considered the highest honor for a young man of his class. Dostler had begun his military career in 1910, joining the Imperial German Army at 19 years old as a cadet. He was part of a generation of Prussian officers trained in the military traditions of Moltke and Schlieffen, where discipline, duty, and unyielding obedience to the chain of command were sacred values. During the First World War, he had served as a junior officer on the Western Front, experiencing trenches, mustard gas, and the massive offensives that characterized that conflict. He survived the war and remained in the army during the Weimar Republic, when the German military force was drastically reduced by the Treaty of Versailles. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933 and began the rearming of Germany in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, career officers like Dostler saw opportunities for professional advancement. They were not necessarily convinced Nazi ideologues. Many of them secretly despised Hitler as an Austrian corporal without proper military lineage, but they appreciated the restoration of German military power and the command opportunities that rearming created. During the Second World War, Dostler had steadily risen in the hierarchy, Chief of Staff of the 7th Army at the start of the war in 1939, where he participated in the planning of operations during the invasion of Poland and France. He later commanded the 57th Infantry Division from 1941 to 1942, then the 163rd Infantry Division during 1942, and finally was promoted to commander of the 75th Army Corps in Italy from January 1944. He was considered a competent and loyal officer, qualities that the Wehrmacht deeply valued. Upon receiving the report about the capture of the American commandos, Dostler immediately consulted with his superior, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, Commander-in-Chief of all German forces in Italy. According to Dostler's aide, Kesselring responded by ordering the execution of the prisoners. The order was based on a secret decree issued by Adolf Hitler on the 18th of October of 1942, the Kommandobefehl, or Commando Order. This decree, one of the most infamous documents of the war, stipulated that all Allied commandos captured in Europe and Africa were to be executed summarily without trial, even if wearing proper uniforms or attempting to surrender. The order had been issued with only 12 original copies, distributed solely to the highest-ranking commanders, with explicit instructions that under no circumstances should it fall into enemy hands. The next day, the 19th of October, 1942, General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations Staff of the OKW, distributed 22 additional copies with an appendix stating that the order was intended only for commanders and should under no circumstances fall into enemy hands. The Kommandobefehl represented a direct violation of international laws of war, specifically the Hague Convention of 1907 and the Geneva Convention of 1929 on prisoners of war. Hitler had justified the order by citing alleged violations of the Geneva Conventions by Allied commandos, particularly during the Dieppe raid in August of 1942 and a raid on the Isle of Sark in October of the same year. During the Dieppe raid, the Germans had captured a copy of Canadian operational orders that included instructions to secure prisoners. Hitler interpreted this as evidence that the Allies planned to execute German prisoners. In the Sark raid, British commandos had temporarily tied the hands of German prisoners to facilitate their extraction during a nighttime retreat. A German prisoner died during the operation in disputed circumstances. The text of the order was unequivocal and brutal. All men operating against German troops in the so-called commando raids in Europe or Africa were to be annihilated to the last man, regardless of whether they were uniformed soldiers or saboteurs, with or without weapons, fighting or attempting to escape. The order went on to specify that this applied regardless of whether they arrived in ships, airplanes, or parachutes, and that even if they attempted to surrender, they were to be given no quarter. The order further stipulated that commandos captured through means other than direct combat, for example by the police in occupied territories, were to be handed over immediately to the Sicherheitsdienst of the SS for immediate execution. On the 25th of March 1944, Dostler sent a telegram to the 135 Fortress Brigade transmitting the execution order for the captured commandos in accordance with Hitler's commando order. The reaction of the subordinate German officers revealed a deep moral division within the Wehrmacht. Colonel Kurt Olmers, commander of the 135 Fortress Brigade, was deeply disturbed by the order. Olmers knew perfectly well that executing uniformed prisoners of war constituted a direct violation of the Geneva Convention of 1929. He immediately contacted the 75 Army Corps headquarters, attempting to achieve a suspension of the execution. His appeal was rejected. Dostler sent another telegram ordering Olmers to execute the order as previously instructed, stipulating that he must report the completion before 7 o'clock in the morning on the 26th of March. The tone of the telegram was imperative and left no room for debate. Olmers made 2 last attempts to stop the execution, including direct phone calls to Dostler's headquarters. On each occasion, Olmers argued that the execution of uniformed prisoners of war violated international conventions and represented a war crime. The intelligence officers of the Abwehr, Claps and Sessler, who had interrogated the Americans, also expressed deep discomfort with the execution order. They had clearly seen that the prisoners were appropriately uniformed and had conducted a legitimate military operation. None of Olmers's appeals were successful. Alexander zu Donner-Schlobitten, a staff officer of Dostler with the rank of Rittmeister, was the protagonist of the most notable act of resistance. Donner-Schlobitten came from the Prussian aristocracy, had served during the invasion of Poland and the Soviet Union, and had been one of the last evacuees from Stalingrad in January of 1943, carrying with him the personal letters and decorations of Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus. When he was ordered to sign the execution order for the Americans, Donner-Schlobitten flatly refused. The German officer argued that signing such an order would constitute a violation of the Geneva Convention of 1929 on prisoners of war, thus committing a war crime. Donner-Schlobitten was unaware of the existence of Hitler's secret commando order. For him, the international laws of war were clear and unquestionable. Uniformed prisoners should be treated as prisoners of war, not executed. His refusal to sign was considered serious insubordination. He was expelled from the Wehrmacht immediately, but he was not prosecuted or executed. The Wehrmacht needed to maintain bureaucratic functioning and could not afford to eliminate all officers who questioned criminal orders. Donner-Schlobitten's expulsion served as a warning to others, but his survival also demonstrated that there were limits to internal reprisals, at least for officers from aristocratic families with powerful connections. In the early morning of the 26th of March of 1944, before dawn, 2 trucks arrived to transport the American prisoners. German Lieutenant Refiel arrived with an escort of 25 men to collect the Americans. Darkness still covered La Spezia when the 15 soldiers were loaded onto the trucks with guards in each vehicle. Lieutenant Paul Trafficante, one of the 2 captured American officers, had managed to conceal a gun stolen from one of the German guards during captivity. He was planning one last desperate attempt to escape. As the convoy moved towards the execution site, Trafficante began to pull the gun out of his sheepskin jacket, but the weapon got caught on the edge of the garment. The guard sitting in front of him simply lowered his rifle, aiming directly at him. The convoy stopped. The guards disarmed Trafficante and thoroughly searched the other 14 men. Any final hope of escape had vanished. At 6:30 in the morning, the trucks arrived at Punta Bianca, south of La Spezia, in the municipality of Ameglia, near the mouth of the Magra River. Oberleutnant Bols, commander of the 1st Company of the 905 Fortress Battalion, waited next to a mass grave that his men had dug the previous day following precise orders. It had to be large enough to contain 15 bodies. The prisoners were formed into 2 groups. They tied their hands behind their backs. There was no trial, no formal hearing, no opportunity for defense. The German firing squad was composed of soldiers from coastal fortification units. Many of these soldiers, according to later testimony, were not enthusiastic volunteers for this task. It was known that members of firing squads frequently attempted to miss their shots intentionally, shooting at non-vital areas of the body or directly at the ground, because they did not want to be individually responsible for the death of a prisoner. This is the reason why firing squads traditionally included multiple shooters, to distribute the responsibility and ensure the quick death of the condemned. The 15 Americans were executed in groups. The volleys echoed on the beach in the dim light of dawn. The bodies fell into the prepared mass grave. The German soldiers covered the bodies with soil and carefully camouflaged the site to prevent it from being discovered by Italian partisans or Allied forces. The executed soldiers were First Lieutenant Vincent Russo of Montclair, New Jersey, First Lieutenant Paul Trafficante of New York, Sergeant Alfred de Flumeri of Natick, Massachusetts, Sergeant Dominic Morrow of New York, Technical Sergeant Livio Viecoli of Manor, Pennsylvania, and technicians Liberty Tremonte, Joseph Farrell, Salvatore Di Sclafani, Angelo Sirico, Thomas Savino, John Leone, Joseph Noia, Rosario Squatrito, Joseph Libardi, and Santoro Calcara. All were Italian Americans, sons and even grandsons of Italian immigrants who had crossed the Atlantic seeking a better life in America, specifically selected for their heritage and language ability for this mission behind enemy lines in the land of their ancestors. The German and Italian radios began broadcasting the following day that a group of American commandos had been annihilated in combat with German troops. The propaganda amplified the lie by adding that the Americans had killed some German soldiers during the skirmish. These broadcasts were completely false. The Americans had been captured after a brief skirmish and executed summarily 2 days later as unarmed prisoners. The Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who according to Dostler's testimony had ordered the execution, immediately felt uncomfortable with the potential consequences of the fact. Kesselring ordered all headquarters involved to destroy all documents related to the incident. This order to destroy evidence was revealing. The German High Command knew perfectly well that they had committed a war crime. The Wehrmacht understood the international laws of war. Officers like Almers and Donner Schlobitten had protested specifically citing the Geneva Conventions. The decision to destroy records demonstrated consciousness of guilt. However, the truth about the fate of the 15 Americans began to gradually leak out. Allied intelligence services intercepted communications that contradicted the official German story. Local Italian residents who had witnessed events related to the capture began to provide information to resistance contacts. By the end of the war, when American forces advanced into northern Italy, 2 men from the battalion 2677 appeared in Bonassola seeking information about the missing Gini men. Captains Albert Lanier and Nevio Manzani reviewed files in local fascist offices and interviewed Italian witnesses. The full picture of the war crime began to emerge. William Donovan, director of the Office of Strategic Services, issued specific orders when it was confirmed that the members of the Gini mission had been executed. The German general in command of the region, Anton Dostler, was to be captured alive to be tried as a war criminal. This directive marked a significant change. Dostler would not simply be another prisoner of war. He would be prosecuted specifically for the crime committed against American soldiers. On the 8th of May, 1945, the day Germany officially surrendered, ending the war in Europe, Anton Dostler became a prisoner of war of the United States Army. By October of 1945, he was detained in Rome, facing a trial for war crimes. The military tribunal was convened at the Royal Palace of Caserta, the magnificent Baroque residence that served as the headquarters of the Allied Supreme Command in Italy, on the 8th of October, 1945. This trial represented a historical moment with multiple precedents. It was the first war crimes trial conducted by the Allies after the end of the war in Europe, even preceding the Nuremberg trials, which would begin in November. It was also the only case in history where a German general officer would be tried and executed for war crimes under the exclusive authority of the United States. All other German generals executed for war crimes were prosecuted in international courts or by other Allied nations. The outcome of this trial would establish precedents that would resonate through all subsequent war crimes trials. The military commission was presided over by Major General Lawrence C. Janes and included Brigadier General Thomas K. Brown, Colonel H. Shaler, Colonel James Notestein, and Colonel F. T. Hammond, Jr. The United States prosecutors were Major Frederick W. Roach, who acted as judge advocate, and First Lieutenant W. T. Andris as assistant judge advocate. Dostler's defense was led by Colonel Claudius O. Wolfe as defense counsel and Major C. K. Emery as assistant defense counsel. All of these men were experienced military lawyers who understood they were participating in a moment that would define the future of international law. The formal charge against Dostler, according to the specification presented by the prosecution, was violation of the laws of war. Specifically, that Anton Dostler, as commander of the 75th German Army Corps, on or about the 25th of March 1944, in La Spezia, Italy, and nearby places, illegally, deliberately, and knowingly ordered that 15 uniformed members of the armed forces of the United States be shot to death, which order was subsequently executed on the 26th of March 1944. The prosecutors presented the case as simple and clear from the beginning. The executed Americans were duly uniformed soldiers on a legitimate military operation when they were captured. Therefore, they had the unequivocal right to be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Conventions of 1929. Their execution without trial violated a rule of international law at least 500 years old, definitively established in the Hague Convention of 1907. The prosecution argued that this was not a legal grey area, but a clear and direct violation of universally accepted norms. The prosecutors called several key witnesses who meticulously built the case. An OSS captain explained in detail the nature of the Guinea team's sabotage mission, establishing that it was a legitimate military operation against strategic military targets. The German intelligence officers, Korvettenkapitän Friedrich Klaps and Oberleutnant zur See Georg Sessler, who had interrogated the prisoners, testified extensively about the circumstances of the interrogation. Their testimony was particularly damaging to the defense because they unequivocally confirmed several critical points. The Americans were properly uniformed in distinctive and recognizable American military uniforms, they wore appropriate rank insignias, they wore no civilian clothing or enemy uniforms, and they had revealed that their mission was sabotaging military infrastructure, not assassinating personnel or terrorism against civilians. Klaps and Sessler also testified, with evident discomfort, that they had expressed concerns about the execution order to their immediate superiors. Their testimony revealed the chain of protests that had occurred within the German command. The most dramatic testimony came from Colonel Kurt Ulmers, who described his multiple attempts to stop the execution, including his direct telephone appeals to Dostler's headquarters. Ulmers testified that he had explicitly argued that the execution would violate the Geneva Convention and constitute a war crime, and that he had been repeatedly ordered to proceed anyway. Dostler's defense attempted multiple lines of argument, each reflecting the legal complexities of the case. Colonel Wolfe first argued that the stealthy nature of the sabotage mission meant that OSS members were actually spies or irregular saboteurs instead of legitimate combatants. They added that the Guinea saboteurs did not wear distinctive military insignia recognizable at a distance as required by Article 1, Chapter 1, Section 1 of the Annex to the Hague Convention, 2 of 1899, and therefore were not appropriately uniformed under the strict legal definition which disqualified them from prisoner of war status. The previous testimony of the Abwehr officers directly contradicted this position. The Germans had clearly identified the Americans as United States Army soldiers in uniform during the interrogations. Photographs of the captured uniforms, presented as evidence, clearly showed United States rank insignias, unit patches, and other distinctive markers. Furthermore, as Major Roche quickly pointed out in a devastating cross-examination, even if the prisoners were treated as spies under the laws of war, which the prosecution vigorously disputed, those same laws required that they receive a legal trial before any execution. Article 30 of the Hague Convention of 1907 was explicit: a captured spy cannot be punished without prior trial. The Americans had not received any type of judicial process, not even the summary trial allowed under martial law. They had been executed within 48 hours of capture without any formal hearing. The defense then resorted to its main and most substantial argument: superior orders, or Befehlsnotstand in German, the concept that a subordinate acting under superior orders cannot be criminally responsible. Colonel Wolf passionately argued that Dostler's oath of obedience to Adolf Hitler, an oath that every German officer had personally taken, required him to obey the Führerbefehl of October of 1942, even if that order violated international law. Wolf presented copies of Hitler's Commissar order and the loyalty oath that Dostler had taken. Anton Dostler testified under oath in his own defense for several hours. He spoke with the upright posture of a professional soldier, his precise German being simultaneously translated into English. Dostler stated that he had had no choice at all. The commandos had been captured conducting a commando raid behind German lines. Hitler's commando order was explicit, binding, and secret, marked as a direct Führer order to be obeyed without question. Dostler further claimed that he had received orders from both General Gustav von Zangen, commander of the von Zangen army group controlling northern Italy, and from Field Marshal Kesselring's headquarters to proceed with the executions. Dostler testified that he had consulted with his superiors specifically because he understood the seriousness of the situation. According to his testimony, he had informed Kesselring about the capture of the United States commandos and requested instructions on how to proceed. The response, according to Dostler, had been unequivocal: execute the Führer's order. Dostler argued that as a German officer, disobeying a direct order from Hitler transmitted through the proper chain of command would have resulted in his own court-martial and probable execution for treason. Colonel Wolf called General Gustav von Zangen to testify. However, von Zangen's testimony was ambiguous and not very useful for the defense. Von Zangen testified on the stand that he had personally not issued a direct execution order to Dostler. This carefully crafted statement significantly weakened Dostler's defense by suggesting that Dostler had acted without clear authorization from all his alleged superiors. The quarterback Albert Kesselring did not appear as a witness at Dostler's trial. This absence was deeply revealing and would be the subject of historical investigation for decades to follow. Dostler had specifically requested that Kesselring and his chief of staff, General Siegfried Westphal, testify in his defense regarding the Guinea execution orders. Both refused to support him. This refusal was extraordinary within the German military culture, where superiors were expected to protect their subordinates. Kesselring, who would face his own war crimes trial in 1947, evidently decided that distancing himself from Dostler was essential for his own survival. Subsequent historical investigations, particularly the meticulous work of Dr. Richard Reiber published in 1996 and 2008, would reveal the full extent of Kesselring's perjury. Reiber, a retired physician who became a historian, discovered in the National Archives microfilmed German operational records that had been overlooked for decades. These documents conclusively showed that Kesselring had systematically lied about his whereabouts on the 24th of March 1944. Although Kesselring claimed in his own later trial to be at his headquarters in Monteserrate north of Rome, or visiting the casino front to the south, troop movement records, dated and sealed operation orders with his location, and communication records proved he was conducting an inspection tour of the coastal defenses, placing him in La Spezia precisely when the Americans were captured on the 24th of March and when they were sentenced to death on the 25th of March. The records showed that Kesselring had met with Dostler at noon on the 24th of March in La Spezia. It was inconceivable that Dostler had not informed his immediate superior during a face-to-face meeting about the capture of 15 American commandos and had not discussed the implementation of Hitler's secret commando order. Kesselring and his chief of staff, Westphal, fabricated a complete false alibi, with Westphal providing false corroborative testimony to prevent Kesselring from facing the same fate as Dostler. By abandoning his subordinate without testimonial support, not even appearing to confirm that he had relayed orders from superiors, Kesselring made it brutally clear that he would save his own life at the expense of Dostler's. This betrayal of a subordinate who had followed his direct orders represented the total collapse of the supposed loyalty and military honor that the Wehrmacht professed. The defense of superior orders, although morally problematic, was not without technical legal foundation in 1945. Colonel Wolfe extensively cited military legal documents. The 1940 version of the United States Army Field Manual on Rules of Land Warfare explicitly stated that an individual would not be punished for a war crime if that crime was committed under orders from his government or superior commander. However, the Army had crucially amended the manual in November of 1944. At the time of Dostler's trial in October of 1945, the manual established a nuanced position. An individual who violated accepted laws and customs of war could be punished. The fact that the reported acts were carried out in accordance with a superior's orders or government sanction could be taken into consideration when determining guilt, either as a defense or in mitigation of punishment. This reformulation was subtle but crucial. Superior orders were no longer an absolute defense but a potential mitigating factor that the court could consider at its discretion. Colonel Wolfe made a passionate and prophetic argument in his closing statement that seemed to resonate with some members of the military tribunal composed entirely of career officers. Wolfe dramatically impressed upon the Commission the danger that the precedent of this case represented. We won the war this time, but nobody knows who will win the next time. We could lose, and then you gentlemen might find yourselves sitting where this man is sitting now. If we find this man guilty due to political pressure, or because he lost the war and is in our power, we might as well not have won the war. This argument touched a deeply sensitive point among career military officers who valued the chain of command as a fundamental pillar of military discipline. However, an immediate precedent was at play. The Nuremberg trials were scheduled to begin in just a few weeks. Dozens of other war crimes proceedings were in preparation. Many of those trials would never take off if a declaration of superior orders could effectively function as an absolute defense for someone of such a high rank as a general, or if the first major war crimes trial resulted in an acquittal. The members of the Commission understood that their decision would be scrutinized by prosecutors, defenders, and defendants in hundreds of future cases. On the 12th of October 1945, after a trial of 4 intense days, the Military Commission found Anton Dostler guilty of violating the laws of war. His sentence was to be shot to death by musketry. The Military Commission explicitly and categorically rejected the defense of superior orders in its written sentence. The court determined that by ordering the mass execution of the 15 American prisoners of war, Dostler had acted on his own accord outside of the Führer's specific orders. This conclusion was legally significant. Hitler's command order specified detailed procedures. If captured commandos fell into German hands through channels other than direct combat, they were to be immediately handed over to the SS Sicherheitsdienst for execution. Dostler had not followed this procedure. The Americans remained in the custody of the Wehrmacht and were executed by German army troops, not by the SS. In this technical sense, Dostler had exceeded the literal terms of the order, acting according to his own judgment. The Commission also rejected his petition for clemency, declaring that no soldier, and even less a commanding general, can say that he considered the summary execution of prisoners of war legitimate, even as reprisal. The Commission declared that the principles established in the Hague and Geneva Conventions represented minimum civilized standards that no military order could legitimately invalidate. The death sentence against Anton Dostler sent shockwaves through the captured German military structure. Thousands of German officers in prisoner camps, many aware that they potentially faced investigations for war crimes, understood that the execution of prisoners would not be tolerated and that high-ranking officers could not shield themselves behind Hitler's orders. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring was deeply alarmed. When he faced his own trial before a British military court in Venice in 1947 for the Ardeatine Caves massacre, he systematically lied about his involvement in the Ginny matter. His perjury underscored the deterrent effect that Dostler's military commission had established. Kesselring was mainly tried for ordering the Ardeatine Caves massacre on March 24, 1944, where 335 Italian civilians were executed as retaliation for a partisan attack in Rome. He was sentenced to death on May 7, 1947, but the sentence was commuted to life imprisonment 2 months later. Kesselring was released in 1952 claiming illness and lived until 1960. He was never held accountable for his involvement in the Ginny executions. The case of Anton Dostler remains unique in history. It is the only case in which a German general officer was tried, convicted, and executed for war crimes under the sole authority of the United States. The 50 days between the sentence and the execution allowed for multiple levels of review. General Joseph McNarney, commanding general of the army in the Mediterranean theater, personally approved the sentence. The War Department in Washington also reviewed the case. There was no clemency, no commutation. The execution would be carried out as ordered. On the 1st of December of 1945, in the early hours of the morning, Anton Dostler was taken to the courtyard of the prisoner camp in Aversa. Dostler was 54 years old and had spent 35 years in military uniform, serving in 2 world wars. Now he faced his death at the hands of soldiers from the army he had fought against. The protocol for military executions was precise. The firing squad was composed of 12 American soldiers. Master Sergeant John Woods and his assistant, military policeman Joseph Malta, supervised the procedure. Dostler was led to the execution site walking upright, maintaining military composure. He was placed against a wooden post and tied. A black hood was placed over his head, according to military regulations. At 8 o'clock sharp in the morning, the commanding officer gave the orders. 12 rifles fired simultaneously. Anton Dostler died instantly. The execution was thoroughly documented with fixed and film cameras. The army wanted a complete record for multiple reasons: evidence that the sentence had been properly carried out, a visual precedent for future trials, and a demonstration to the international community that the United States would take decisive action against violators of the laws of war. The photographs captured the complete sequence: Dostler being tied to the post, the squad taking positions, the moment of the execution, and his body being removed. Immediately afterward, Dostler's body was lifted onto a stretcher, wrapped in a white cotton shroud, and transported in a military truck. His remains were buried in grave 93 diagonal 95 of Section H, in the German war cemetery of Pomezia, south of Rome. This cemetery contains the graves of 27,000 German soldiers killed during the Italian campaign. Dostler's grave has no special distinction. It is simply one among thousands, although his death was fundamentally different. He was executed for his responsibility for crimes against the laws of war. The execution of Anton Dostler established fundamental legal precedents that would resonate far beyond his individual case. The court explicitly rejected the defense of superior orders, establishing that soldiers and officers cannot be relieved of responsibility for war crimes simply by citing orders from superiors. This principle was later codified in Principle 4 of the Nuremberg Principles and in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. The Nuremberg trials, which began a few weeks after Dostler's execution, adopted and expanded these principles. 19 of the main defendants were convicted. 12 were sentenced to death. Many cited higher orders in their defense. None were acquitted based on that argument. The Dostler case had set the precedent. The trial and execution were controversial even at the time. Some senior officers of the United States Army expressed doubts about the fairness of the verdict in conversations with reporters. Professional soldiers felt uncomfortable with the idea that subordinates could be held accountable for following orders from superiors. However, the new post-war morality was emerging. The magnitude of the Nazi atrocities revealed when the concentration camps were liberated had fundamentally changed attitudes towards blind military obedience. The world determined that there were lines that no soldier should cross, regardless of the orders received. The fate of the 15 American soldiers was not forgotten. After the war, their bodies were exhumed from the mass grave in Punta Bianca. 7 were buried in the American military cemetery near Florence. The other 8 were repatriated to the United States to be buried in family plots. Memorial monuments were erected in Italy. The municipality of Ameglia established a permanent memorial. Each year, ceremonies remember Operation Ginny II and the men who died. The story of Alexander zu Dohna-Schlobitten provides a fascinating counterpoint. Dohna-Schlobitten survived the war. Expelled from the Wehrmacht but not executed, he returned to his estate of Schlobitten during the Soviet takeover. He organized the escape of 330 refugees in January of 1945, saving human lives and Trakehner horses. He moved to Switzerland in 1948, worked for Hoffmann La Roche, and died in 1997 at 97 years old. His refusal to sign a criminal order cost him his career, but saved his life and conscience. His example demonstrates that even within an authoritarian system, moral choices existed. The Dostler case revealed the contradictions in the German military system. The Wehrmacht demanded absolute obedience to the chain of command. But when that obedience resulted in war crimes, the superiors abandoned their subordinates. Kesselring let Dostler face the responsibility alone for an order that he had probably approved. The system that demanded loyalty upwards did not offer loyalty downwards when it was time to be held accountable. The commando order was cited in multiple war crime trials after 1945. The Nuremberg court found that the order was a direct violation of the laws of war. German officers who executed Allied commandos under this order were prosecuted in Europe. Some were executed, others received long prison sentences. Field Marshal Rommel had ignored the order when he could, ordering that captured commandos be treated as regular prisoners. This decision saved lives and probably saved Rommel's reputation as an officer who maintained certain standards of honorable conduct. The legacy of the Dostler case extends to modern international law. The principles established in his trial are part of international humanitarian law. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, adopted in 1998, incorporates these principles. The defense of superior orders is explicitly limited. It may be considered in sentencing, but does not constitute an absolute defense against liability for war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide. The Geneva Conventions of 1949, adopted 4 years after Dostler's execution, codified many of the protections for prisoners of war that were violated in the Ginny case. These conventions form the basis of modern international humanitarian law and have been ratified by almost every country in the world. The photograph of Anton Dostler, tied to the post, has become an iconic image of post-war justice. For some, it represents the triumph of international law over military impunity. For others, it embodies the moral complexities of holding individuals accountable within authoritarian systems. The debate about the fairness of the sentence continues among historians and legal scholars. Some argue that a general in a totalitarian dictatorship faced impossible choices. However, the example of Dohna-Schlobitten complicates this narrative. Dohna-Schlobitten refused to sign the order and was simply expelled, not executed. This suggests that there was room for resistance, albeit with serious professional consequences. The impact on the development of modern military justice codes was significant. The armed forces incorporated training on the laws of war and the obligation to disobey illegal orders. The United States Uniform Code of Military Justice specifies that service members have the duty to disobey illegal orders. The case also had implications for the doctrine of command responsibility. It established that commanders cannot simply pass on criminal orders without assuming personal responsibility. A commander has the duty to assess the legality of orders and protect prisoners under their control. The implications continue to develop. The trials of the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia and Rwanda cited the principles established in cases like Dostler. Recent cases in Syria, Myanmar, and other conflicts are analyzed using legal frameworks that date back to the decisions of 1945. The tension between military obedience and individual responsibility remains relevant. The case of Anton Dostler represents more than the execution of a general for a specific crime. It encapsulates the fundamental transformations in how the international community understood military responsibility and the limits of command authority. The trial declared that there are universal standards of human conduct that transcend national borders, military loyalties, and orders from superiors. No soldier can shield themselves behind orders when committing acts that violate fundamental principles of humanity. This was a revolutionary notion in 1945. The photographs of Dostler continue to provoke debate about justice, responsibility, and the consequences of serving criminal regimes. Dostler was not Himmler nor Eichmann. He did not design the Holocaust. He was a professional soldier who followed orders that he knew or should have known were criminal. His execution sent the message that being a cog in the machinery of crime does not exempt one from responsibility. The 15 American soldiers did not live to see justice served. They died executed as defenseless prisoners. However, their deaths were not in vain. The case that arose helped to establish principles that have saved countless lives by warning commanders that they will be held responsible for crimes against prisoners. The trial and execution of Anton Dostler remain one of the defining moments in the development of modern international humanitarian law. The decision to prosecute a German general immediately after the war, setting precedents that would be applied at Nuremberg and beyond, demonstrated the Allied commitment to justice based on rules rather than revenge. Although imperfect, post-war justice aspired to higher standards than the law of the strongest. At dawn on the 1st of December 1945, when the bullets ended Anton Dostler's life, not only did the story of a German general end, but a chapter in the evolution of the concept of individual responsibility under international law also closed. The execution post in Aversa symbolized the end of an era where superior orders could justify any act. In its place emerged a new legal order declaring that there are lines no human being should cross, no matter who orders the crossing. The impact of the Dostler case immediately resonated in the military and legal circles of all Allied nations. In the weeks following the execution, war crimes prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions began citing the Dostler precedent in their preparations for pending trials. Defense attorneys, for their part, meticulously studied the trial transcripts, seeking alternative arguments that could be more successful than the failed superior orders defense. The Dostler verdict became the fundamental case study in all subsequent trials, an unavoidable point of reference that defined the parameters of the legal debate on command responsibility. In the German prisoner of war camps spread across Europe, the news of Dostler's execution quickly circulated among the thousands of captured officers. Many faced the real possibility of being prosecuted for actions taken during the war. The message was unequivocal. Rank offered no protection. Orders from superiors did not constitute an absolute defense, and Allied justice was willing to execute death sentences against high-ranking officers. This realization caused considerable anxiety, but also led many German officers to cooperate more fully with Allied investigators, providing information on the chain of command, orders received, and crimes committed by others in an attempt to mitigate their own potential guilt. The execution also generated intense debate within the United States Armed Forces themselves. Veteran officers who had fought throughout the entire war expressed divided opinions. Some argued that Dostler had been treated fairly, that the laws of war should be applied without exceptions, and that establishing this precedent was essential to prevent future atrocities. Others, particularly those from the old military guard, felt deeply uncomfortable with the implications of the verdict for the military command structure. They argued in private conversations that modern warfare required instant obedience to orders, and that allowing subordinates to legally question superiors' directives could fatally undermine military effectiveness. However, these debates remained largely within professional military circles, as publicly the army presented a unified front of support for the verdict. The international media extensively covered both the trial and the execution. American newspapers generally supported the verdict, framing it as a necessary step towards establishing an international order based on laws rather than brute force. The British press adopted a similar tone, although some commentators expressed concern about the consistent application of these standards. Newspapers in neutral countries like Switzerland and Sweden offered more nuanced analyses, pointing out both the importance of the legal precedent and the moral complexities of holding individuals accountable who operated within authoritarian hierarchical military structures. In occupied Germany, where the civilian population was beginning to face the magnitude of the crimes committed by the Nazi regime, the reaction to the Dostler case was complex and multifaceted. Some Germans, particularly those who had lost loved ones in the Allied bombings or in combat, saw the execution of Dostler as the revenge of the victorious disguised as justice. Others, especially those who had suffered under the Nazi regime or who were beginning to understand the scale of the Holocaust, recognized that massive crimes required individual accountability. The German press under Allied control published information about the trial, contributing to the painful process of denazification and re-education that the occupying powers considered essential for the democratic transformation of Germany. The Dostler case also established important procedural precedents for the Nuremberg trials that would begin in November of 1945. The Nuremberg prosecutors carefully studied how the prosecution had presented documentary evidence, interrogated witnesses, and constructed a coherent narrative of criminal responsibility. The techniques used to refute the defense of superior orders in the Dostler case were refined and expanded for subsequent trials. The very structure of the military tribunal in the Dostler case, with its combination of American military procedures and recognition of international law, provided a model that would inform the design of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. Beyond the immediate legal implications, the Dostler case contributed to a fundamental shift in how democratic societies conceived the relationship between individuals and military institutions. The notion that soldiers could and should exercise independent moral judgment, even within strict hierarchical structures, represented a radical departure from traditional conceptions of military discipline. This conceptual change would take decades to be fully integrated into military doctrines and training programs, but the Dostler case marked a crucial symbolic and historical turning point in this transformation process. The 15 American soldiers whose illegal execution had initiated this legal process received posthumous recognition. In addition to the physical monuments erected in Italy, they were awarded military medals for their service. Their families received the official condolences of the American government and compensation for their losses. However, no amount of official recognition could completely compensate for the tragedy of their deaths. They were young, many just in their 20s, sons of Italian immigrants who had crossed the Atlantic seeking opportunities. They had returned to the land of their ancestors, not as visitors, but as liberators, only to be killed in violation of all civilized conventions. The legacy of the Dostler case also extended to the development of military legal education. Military law schools in the United States and other Allied countries began to incorporate the case into their curricula, using it as an educational tool to teach future military lawyers about the intersection between national law, international law, and moral obligations. Generations of legal officers would study the trial transcripts, analyzing the arguments of both parties and the implications of the verdict. The case became fundamental material not only for law students, but also for command officers who needed to understand the legal limits of their authority. The speed with which the Dostler case was conducted, from capture in May to execution in December of 1945, also set expectations on how quickly post-war justice should proceed. This urgency reflected an understandable desire of the Allies to demonstrate determination in pursuing war crimes while the evidence was fresh and the witnesses available. However, it would also generate later criticisms about whether some war crimes trials moved too quickly, potentially compromising due process in the interest of achieving swift convictions. The Dostler case, with its trial of only 4 days for a matter of such historical importance, exemplified both the strengths and the potential weaknesses of this rapid justice approach.